Good evening. I took another week off last week. I didn't do the T, but I'm doing the U. I'm becoming more and more unreliable as we get closer and closer to the end of the alphabet, but I need to do my best to keep up. And so we have the U tag today from Jim over at Jim's Books Reading and Stuff, who is a machine who cranks these out every week. And man, it's great to have these to rely on to do. So thank you so much, Jim, for making it happen. Um, First prompt. U is for unicorn. What is your favorite fantasy creature? I'm gonna cheat a little bit, um, because as all true nerds know, Star Wars is not science fiction. Star Wars is set fantasy. So my favorite fantasy creature, I'm going with Salacious Bee Crumb, uh, who there's a book, an anthology story anthology, from the old pre Disney days of the expanded universe, Tales of Jabba's Palace, and there's a story in there that's the origin story of Salacious Crumb, and it's worth your time to track that one down. He's an interesting dude. He's much more than his his screen time in Return of the Jedi would lead you to believe. U is for USA. If you are from the U.S., what state do you live in, and what is special about the state you are in? So I'm from Minnesota, which is well documented, I would imagine, at this point. I have also lived in Syracuse, New York for a time. Um, I moved. I lived there from 2015 to 2016 for a little over a year. Um, so Minnesota, what are we known for? In the world of sports, we are known for dramatic disappointment. Famously, we have a you know a we have a sports team in every major league in American sports, but only the Twins, our baseball team, has ever won a championship. They won two times, in 1989 and 1991. They won the World Series, in a team led by Kirby Puckett, legendary Kirby Puckett. Um, but so Minnesota sports, men's sports, I should specify, has not won a championship in 30 years. So basically, my lifetime. Vikings have, I believe, four Super Bowl appearances with zero losses. They have gone to the divisional finals twice in my lifetime, which is the final game of the division, and whoever wins that goes to the Super Bowl. And both times that they were in that game, they lost at the final minute because they missed a field goal. The Timberwolves, famously, Kevin Garnett started out and played for the Timberwolves for a long time, and he carried that team, but you can't win at basketball with one guy. So we never did well, even though we had one of the best players in the league. And then eventually he left and went other places and got his rings that he deserved. Minnesota athletes have ranked among some of the best hockey players in all of sports history. The Miracle on Ice U.S. men's hockey team that won the Olympic gold against the USSR in the 80s was made up of a lot of Minnesotans. But the Minnesota hockey teams have never done well. When I was a kid, we lost our hockey team uh, in the early 90s, and then we didn't have a hockey team for like 10 years until we got the Wild in like 2002, I want to say. And the Wild have never, you know, done anything. They've never been to the Stanley Cup or anything like that. Um, so yeah, a lot of disappointment in the world of being a Minnesota sports fan. In the world of the arts, we're known, of course, for Prince, Rogers Nelson, who was from Minneapolis, raised in Minneapolis, and then spent most of his adult life living in the far southwest suburb of Chanhassen, where he built his compound Paisley Park, which has now become a sort of Graceland-style museum in his honor. Minnesota, also the birthplace and origin of Bob Dylan. He's from Hinckley, which is up north in the Iron Range. And some other, notable musical groups. In the 80s, we had, a number of very well-known punk bands like The Replacements and Husker Du, as well as some maybe less known but very important and influential people like Cows, great avant-garde noise rock band. We had the Trashmen in the 60s, the men who were responsible for the song Surfin' Bird. Those guys are from Minneapolis. And more recently, Lizzo. Not originally from Minneapolis, she's from Texas, but she moved to Minneapolis in her 20s and kind of came up through the local Minnesota hip-hop scene. Did her first record with a bunch of the people from local hip-hop collective Doomtree, album called Lizzo Bangers. And then she got signed to a major label, left Minnesota, disavowed it completely, never looked back, made her first album unavailable, let it go out of print and took it off of streaming services and tried to pretend it didn't exist for a long time. Just wanted nothing to do with Minnesota whatsoever. That's my favorite kind of person from Minnesota, are people who do that. Bob Dylan also famously doesn't want anything to do with Minnesota. Yeah, and we've got other artists. Alex Soth, the photographer, one of my favorite photographers. He's from Minnesota, does amazing stuff. There's a lot of great art and stuff in Minnesota. And then also, we are known for being the coldest state in the country on average. We have very brutal and long winters. And it is frequently in the negative Fahrenheit temperature, like on a pretty much daily basis from like December through February. I love Minnesota a lot. I mean, I've got it on my arm. It might not be where if I had, unlimited resources, I might not stay here, there are places I've been that I've liked a lot that I might rather live. I do have very strong roots here, very close friends here that I love very dearly and don't want to leave that behind, and my parents, of course, are here too. But if I had no worries, I would live in New York City. That shit just like gives me life. I know a lot of people can't hang with something like with a place like that, but it just like fills me with life. I don't know what it is, but like super dense urban centers like that just is my jam. I love it. Yeah, and a lot of people who have never been to the U.S. don't realize how big the U.S. is. So when we moved from Minnesota to New York, that's halfway across the country along the northern border. So it's, in terms of across the country, you can go a lot further. It's still 2,000 miles, 3 days of driving to get there each way. So there are a lot of parts of the country that I've never been to. I've been around the Midwest, all over, because that's where I'm from. And I've been to like Colorado. My uncle, when he was alive, lived in Colorado, and my cousin, when I was 13, my cousin passed away, and so we went and spent a week in Colorado for his funeral. I have an uncle and his family that live in Houston, Texas. So when he got remarried when I was 10, we spent like a week in Houston, but I didn't really do anything there or see anything other than we went to the Space Center. Also, I was 10, so like whatever. I've been to Florida on 3 separate occasions. I went on vacation there with my father to Orlando when I was like 10. And then I have a very close family friend who lives in West Palm Beach. When I was 17, right after I graduated high school, I went and spent like 2 weeks with her, and went all around. We went to Miami and Fort Lauderdale and many other places on the east side of Florida. And then maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, I went with my ex-wife and her parents. Her foster parents have a vacation home on an island on the Gulf called Boca Grande, which were the Bush family vacations. These are very wealthy people. And so we went and spent a week there. But that was also kind of whatever because it's very isolated. You're on this island and there's nothing to do. We mostly played board games. And then when I lived in New York, we went to places around New England a little bit. We went to, Boulder and Buffalo and Rochester and Niagara and Toronto, and we spent like 4 days in Boston once. That was probably the most fun I had doing any sort of trip when I was out there. It was when we went to Boston. We were there on St. Patrick's Day weekend, and it was crazy. We got very drunk and had a good old time. But so I've never been to the South, like the Bible Belt. I've been to Florida and I've been to Texas, I guess. But like, the Bible Belt is kind of like the Virginia going down through the Carolinas and Georgia and scooping over to Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, etc. Never been there. I've never been to the Southwest. I've never been to Arizona. I've never been to Vegas. My ex and her best friend, who was our roommate, they went on a besties vacation to Vegas a few years ago, but I was not invited, so I've never been to Vegas. I've never been to California, any part of California, and I have been to Seattle. My best friend from college, after we graduated, he did AmeriCorps and moved to Seattle for a number of years. And so I went and spent like 10 days with him in Seattle. That was a lot of fun. I had a really good time in Seattle, and I love Seattle. And I would live in Seattle at the drop of a hat if I could afford it. There's a lot of rambling about the United States. There is a lot to not like about the United States. It is a deeply, deeply, deeply flawed place, and we are a deeply flawed people, I think. But I think that the reason why people care so much, the reason why I care so much, is because it's a place that's worth saving and making better. The other parts of the world, they created a lot of things, but I like to think that America perfected a lot of them. It's mostly in jest, but we in terms of music and film and art and things like that. You know, we make some good shit, I have to say. Maybe a little overrated in the global pantheon, but it's pretty good. Pretty good stuff. U is for Uruguay, Uganda, the United Arab Emirates, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Upper Volta, now known as Burkina Faso. Have you read any books connected with any of these countries? The only one that I can think of is Everything is Illuminated, the debut novel by Jonathan Safran Foer. I read this book when I was not in high school, just after high school, because my girlfriend at the time, who was like my first long-term year-plus girlfriend, her favorite book was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, his second book. So I read that one, and then I read this one, because those were the only two that he had published at the time. Everything is Illuminated is a pretty good book. It's interesting, where it's a dual narrative, where half of the book is about this small Jewish village, shtetl, in the Ukraine, in the early 20th century, and the narrative centers around the author's grandfather, but it's very surreal and sort of magical realist, interesting, sort of weird storytelling. And then the other narrative is about Jonathan Safran Foer as a character going to Ukraine to learn about where his grandfather came from, go to this village and learn about him, but it's narrated by this Ukrainian man who is his English language interpreter, and so those sections of the book are all written in broken English because they're narrated by a man who English is his second language. Maybe hasn't aged well. I think that there is a case for saying that you're making light of someone's inability to speak English properly. Maybe, I don't know. Also, maybe it's problematic because it's mostly played for laughs, where he not only speaks English in a sort of broken way, but he's obsessed with the thesaurus, and so he's constantly using words, very big and complicated words, in ways that are very unnatural. In the opening chapter, he talks about how he's a playboy and he goes to clubs, and when he goes to the club, he disseminates copious amounts of currency, things like that. It's a decent book, probably. I haven't read it in over 10 years. They made a movie out of it. It was directed by Liev Schreiber, the actor from the Scream franchise, as well as Ray Donovan, and then starring Elijah Wood. And the movie is just an adaptation of the current day Jonathan Safran Foer section of the book. The other second narrative is not in the movie at all, which is fine. I think it works fine as a movie in that way. The movie's pretty good. Jonathan Safran Foer, of course, wound up being a fucking weirdo. He didn't do anything that I think would deserve people canceling him or boycotting his work, but basically he was married to the incredibly talented novelist Nicole Krauss, who wrote a book called The History of Love. That's a very, very good novel that I read around the same time that I read Foer's books. And then he struck up a friendship. He befriended Natalie Portman, and they were both married at the time, and he fell in love with Natalie Portman, and without like consulting with Natalie Portman. He left his wife. He was like, I'm leaving you for Natalie Portman. And then went to Natalie Portman and was like, I'm in love with you, and I know you're in love with me too, and I left my wife, and you should leave your husband, and we should be together. And she was like, no, that is not what is happening at all, and that's not going to happen, and you're weird, and we're not friends anymore. And then Jonathan Safran Foer was alone. It seems like a theme in Natalie Portman's life. Famously, a few years ago, Moby, in an interview, talked about how he had dated Natalie Portman in the 90s, and then she publicly was like, no, we didn't. Like, we hung out twice, but we did not date, and that's very weird that you think that we did. It's unfortunate that Natalie Portman has that happening in her life. So yeah, Jonathan Safran Foer. That, like I said, I don't think it's like a cancelable offense, but it did give me kind of a sour taste. And also I was like, like reading his books, the way he is, I think you learn a lot about someone when you read their book. And I was kind of not surprised that he did something like that. And what a slight to Nicole Krauss too, right? And they had kids together and stuff. Is not great. And so when he had his follow-up books come out, I did not read them. He was for Umbrella by Rihanna. Classic song. What is a good book for a rainy day? I'm going to say Ariel by Sylvia Plath. Ariel was the second of Sylvia Plath's 2 poetry collections, and it was published posthumously after her suicide. Famously, Ted Hughes, her husband, who was also a poet, collected her, manuscripts, her unpublished poems that she had been working on in the few years leading up to her death, and then edited them and compiled them into Ariel and published it. But there was a lot of, and has long been a lot of controversy about that because of his editorializing and choosing what went in and what didn't, because a lot of people ascribed blame to him for her death. The contentiousness of their relationship was not secret, and a lot of people wanted to blame him for her suicide and felt like it wasn't his place to be in charge of her work. And fair. There is, in recent years, they published this facsimile edition that is all of the poems in their original state, untouched by Ted Hughes, which is good. I think for historians and literary scholars, it's important that things like that exist, and it's interesting too if you're a great fan of Sylvia Plath like I am. But I don't think it's necessary or anything like that. I think if you just track down a used old paperback copy of Ariel for a couple bucks, it's gonna do you right. It's got all the good jams in it. And as far as dreary, sad, sort of morose poetry goes, I don't think it gets better than Sylvia Plath. A lot of people like Emily Dickinson, but I'm I don't like rhyming poetry. It just fucking makes me mad. It sounds dumb. I'm sorry. Plath is she really felt it, she's one of those people where you read her stuff and you're like, yeah, it makes sense that she ovened herself at the end, which is unfortunate. You never want that, right? You always want people to get better and get help, and it doesn't always happen. It's very sad, but we will always have those few pieces of her work. U is for urban fantasy. Have you read any urban fantasy, and do you have a favorite? So, like Jim said in the original video, Jim Butcher is the big guy in urban fantasy with his books, and I did try and read the first Jim Butcher book, and I hated it, just like with every fiber of my being. I resisted that book. I think I read like 30 pages of it, and I had to stop because like everything that happened in it I just despised. Is just the antithesis of what I want in a book. It felt like the insufferable dude at the party who thinks he's really cool and really funny like wrote a book. That's what it felt like to me. Not my thing at all. And I'm not a big fantasy guy either. Urban fantasy I think is more maybe palatable, but nah. And so for my favorite urban fantasy, this is a cheat a little bit, but I'm gonna go with the tabletop RPG world, World of Darkness, more specifically with their setting, Vampire the Masquerade. So World of Darkness is sort of all shared lore and world. They all take place in the same world, but Vampire the Masquerade focuses on vampires. There's Werewolf the Apocalypse and various other ones that focus on other sort of mythical beasts and creatures or whatever. But Vampire the Masquerade is an urban fantasy, absolutely, and it is a tabletop system that you can play games in, but it is also a world that is established and has tons of lore that you can use to build your campaigns, and there are lots of fiction that have been written set in this world, and there are video games that have been made that is set in this world. That's how I was first introduced to it. It was from the 2004 PC game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which is a very, very good game. And I ran a campaign of Vampire for about a year and a half, a couple years back. And it was a very good time. I had a great time doing it, and all of my players had a great time doing it. I'm constantly being told that we need to make that happen again, get another campaign going. And it's interesting, it's set modern times, vampires living amongst humans, and vampires generally live in urban centers and cities because that allows them to hunt and feed more easily, and then they can also there's nightlife in the city, and so they're able to blend in more easily, and they maintain this set of laws called the Masquerade, which keeps them hidden from humanity, and there are sort of warring governing bodies of vampires, the two main ones being the Camarilla, which is sort of a more traditional, long-standing governing body that's clearly influenced by like monarchies of Europe from the Middle Ages and like the Catholic Church and things like that, and they uphold the Masquerade and want to keep vampires hidden. And then their counterpoint is the Sabbat, who are vampires that basically believe in vampiric supremacy. They want to control the world, basically, because they believe that they are superior to humans. Rather than having to hide amongst the humans, they think that they should rule the humans. And so, in a very sort of simplistic term, it feels a lot of the time like the Camarilla are the good guys and the Sabbat are the bad guys. But it's not that simple. There aren't really any good guys or bad guys. And then there are all these different sort of breeds of vampire that have allegiances to one side or the other, or are their own thing. There's also groups that are referred to as anarchs, which is short for anarchists, who are like, they reject both sides and want to establish their own thing, and each side controls different territories throughout the country, and they go to war occasionally, and it's very deep and complex and interesting lore that goes back throughout all of human history, because there are vampires, obviously, that are, hundreds, thousands of years old, and the older you get, the more powerful you become. But the more you lose your humanity, right? I could talk about Vampire the Masquerade for forever. So that's my answer. U is for unread. Roughly what percentage of the books on your shelf are unread? Of the books on my shelf, 100% of them are unread, because as I exist currently, if I have read something and I like it enough that I'm going to keep it, I pack it away, because I have just such a limited amount of space. It's just, I don't have room to display everything, so I'm prioritizing the things I haven't read, because then I have easy access to take them off the shelf and read them. Right now I have I have a bookshelf in my bedroom, but it couldn't fit everything on it, and so I'm kind of stuck at an impasse and unsure of where to go from there. I've got another second smaller shelf that I might bring in and figure out where to put somewhere to fill in the rest of it, and then I've got this little shelf just off of the side of my desk here in the main area of the basement, where I have stuck the things that I'm more interested in reading in the immediate future. Things that I've picked up recently, things that I am more excited about, basically. Which of the following authors most appeals to you? Leon Uris, Umberto Eco, or Ursula K. Le Guin? So I have not read anything by any of these three authors. Leon Uris, I'm not a Westerns fan, so he doesn't really appeal to me. And Umberto Eco and Ursula Le Guin both do appeal to me, and I own books by both of them that I want to read and have wanted to read for a long time. I really like secret societies and conspiracies and stuff like that, and so, Umberto Eco is kind of the king of that, right? With Foucault's Pendulum and Name of the Rose. And I also really like science fiction and speculative fiction like Ursula Le Guin does, and Left Hand of Darkness sounds like such a cool idea for a story. I really want to read it. So, one of those two. U is for UFO. Have you seen a UFO? I have not. And have you enjoyed a book exploring first contact with aliens? I have. Definitely. The Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer deals with maybe not first contact, but alien life comes to Earth, and it details the attempts by humans to try and interact with and understand the alien life. Sort of a science fiction horror trilogy of books. Very good. The first one, of course, Annihilation, was adapted into a movie starring Natalie Portman, of aforementioned relationship woes. But the movie was pretty good. It was very good, actually. But it was also like a big failure, box office bomb. Nobody saw it. So track that down if you like it. If you like the movie, read the book. Read the books. The first book, Annihilation, is very different. There's a lot of things that are different. And then, of course, the 2 subsequent books add tons more to enjoy. And there are other books about aliens and UFOs that are good, too. U is for upcoming. What book release are you looking forward to? There's only one book coming out in the near future that I know about, and that is Devil House by John Darnielle. John Darnielle is the leader and singer and songwriter behind the band The Mountain Goats, which he has led since the early 90s, and in the last 10 years he started publishing fiction. First he wrote a novella for the legendary music book series 33 and a Third. He did the book on Black Sabbath's Master of Reality, but instead of writing a journalistic piece about the history of the album like most people do, he wrote a novella about a teenage boy who was obsessed with that album. And then he followed that up with a novel, Wolf and White Van, which was a very, very, very good book about a man who makes a living doing RPGs through the mail, where he's got these different settings, the worlds that he's created, and people will mail him a letter detailing what they do, and then he will mail a letter back to them detailing what happens next, and then they continue this way. But he is haunted by when he was a teenager, he attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head, and it left him incredibly scarred and disfigured, and because of that he's unable to be part of normal society, and he's removed from society. And then there's this incident that happens with these teenagers who are playing his game, who are mentally unwell and become delusionally convinced that the world of the game is reality, and that if they go to this remote area in, I think it's Nebraska, that they'll be able to find this ancient or mystical treasure or something, and tragedy ensues, and the narrator is then held responsible for their actions. And it's just a very great and complicated look at mental health and trauma and guilt, and yeah, great book. And then he wrote a book called Universal Harvester that was sort of a kind of a horror book, a little bit. It sort of presents itself like it's going to be a horror book, and then it ends up becoming much more complicated than that. That is about this man who works at a video store, and people start complaining about the tapes that they're renting have been taped over with this weird homemade camcorder footage of disturbing and unsettling things. And then he sort of falls into this rabbit hole of trying to figure out who's doing it and what is happening. But so that Universal Harvester, that came out about 4 years ago. And so now John has announced he's got a new book, Devil House. It's coming out in January. And I pre-ordered a signed first edition copy of it through the independent bookstore in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he lives. I don't remember the name of the store. The description on Goodreads is Gage Chandler is descended from kings. That's what his mother always told him. Now he's a true crime writer with one grisly success and movie adaptation to his name, along with a series of subsequent lesser efforts that have paid his bills but not much more. Now he is being offered the chance for a big break to move into the house the locals call the Devil House, in which a briefly notorious pair of murders occurred, apparently the work of disaffected 1980s teenagers. He begins his research with diligence and enthusiasm, but soon the story leads him into a puzzle he never expected, back into his own work and what it means, back to the very core of what he does and who he is. So, knowing that both of John's previous books were fantastic, and this one has a lot of boxes being checked for me. True crime stuff, satanic panic, 80s shit is my jam, and rabbit holes and mysteries and things like that are always very appealing to me too. So I'm very, very excited for that book. So expect me to live until January to see it happen. So yeah, that's it for this tag. This is very long. I'm probably going to cut a bunch of this out so that it's not as long. Thanks for watching.